I think most of you know that I had a show at Ponte Vedra last fall, and what they asked me to do for that was to bring in about 15 pieces, but they wanted them all black. And, you know, because I do some black pieces anyway. I've done them over the years, and they saw them on the website and they liked them, and they said, so make them black. And you know what, doing 2 or 3, pretty straightforward. Doing 15 that are all going to be shown together so they don't get boring, I had to figure out about every way I could to make them black, and I did. When I was done, I probably had 15 different blacknesses on them, different ways of doing black. So I want to start off with one of them. I'm going to turn this thing probably black, and they probably aren't going to be too happy about that. But something I started a long time ago. I used to do a lot of ornaments, hollow globe ornaments, where I would make the globe out of cherry or some wood like that. But I'd make the finials and ebonize them, and so I would have black finials. And I started doing that. So I'm going to, let me do these 2 things. There are a couple of articles I've asked Keith to put on the website about ebonizing this process that I'm going to do first, all right? This is one he wrote, so he knows all about it. And then this is another one that goes into a lot of detail. The most typical way that woodturners get into ebonizing is to use a solution. Now this got dark, and I'll tell you, have any of you done ebonizing? All right, so it's, for me, it's take a stainless, or excuse me, a steel wool pad, wash it with soap, because it usually contains oil to keep it from rusting, and that'll slow down the dissolution process. So wash your steel wool, put it in a jar like this, and then fill that jar with distilled white vinegar. All right. As it leave the cap loose, because it will generate some gas over time. But this material will form like an iron acetate, and it will ebonize on its own. So all you have to do, I made this about a week ago, and what this does is it reacts with the tannin in the wood to turn black. And that's why this stuff is normally clear. You wouldn't think it's clear, it should be full of rust and stuff, but I filter it out and it added color. It's clear, there's no particulate in it. But what you would like to have is a wood that has a fair amount of tannin in it, and it'll react with that. So I'm just going to take this is just some oak.
Which ones have more tannin in? Is this specific?
Well, you can look it up, but light colored woods are generally not so much. And you can see just here at the edge, okay, it's beginning to turn. We'll give this a minute. Then there are some other woods that are better. So this is some cherry. So that's getting, yep.
No sealer or anything on that, right?
No, you don't want sealer on it. You want it to react with the wood. So you can see this is getting dark pretty quick. Okay, and you're getting, you know, it's not changing too much here, but we'll get there. It'll take a little longer for this, but you can see that's getting pretty black already. And I used to turn my finials out of cherry mainly, and so it was easy to just blacken them up real quick. And then you got something like this, which is just maple, right? And so maple is one of those, it really doesn't have much tannin in it. So I'm going to just leave this here. And you can watch these turn over time. But, yeah, there's another material that can make this work better. Again, because this is a reaction with tannin, the more tannin you have in, the better that reaction is going to be. And so there is a bark, it comes in a powder form, and the source and everything will be in these handouts. And you mix a tablespoon in a pint of water, hot water, stir it all up, and you get this. It's called quebracho. It's from a tree bark from South America. And what you do with this is you take this, and you put this on first. Could somebody get me a paper towel or two? And I'm going to put it on the cherry. And I'm going to put it on the maple as well.
This is different than what you put on the first?
Yes, this is not an ebonizing solution. All this is tannin source. Thanks. All right, because the iron reacts with tannin, and so you want the tannin, you want to apply some extra tannin to your wood. All right, that's what we're doing here. And I gotta wait a minute until it dries a little bit. It can be damp, it doesn't have to dry completely. Okay, so there, I'll put that on. And now I'm going to go back, it's damp, and I'm going to go back to my iron acetate solution. Pretty quick. All right.
Could you spell that, the product that you were just saying to us?
Yeah, somebody bought it. Bob, did you buy it?
I got some. You want some?
Yeah.
Anybody want some? I'll bring in 2 jars of it, because I wouldn't get to buy them 5 pounds or something.
I bought 10 pounds.
Yeah, 10 pounds.
Here's the oak.
You still got it?
Yeah, it's in sports.
Yeah, and so the stuff Bob bought, we divvied up at a club meeting, and so you can see there's the cherry been on what 3 minutes, and here's been on less than a minute. All right, and this has the quebracho on it.
Will you turn it this way for everybody?
Sorry.
Or wrap around?
All right, so it goes pretty quick, and it'll, you know, it's as deep as water will penetrate because it's aqueous, you know. So you can't sand it too much or you'll sand it off, but this should be sanded to about 320, no more, because once you get over 320, you start to really seal wood more. And if you are concerned about having a perfect surface, does everybody know about raising grain? You take some water, misting, spray on your piece, let it dry, sand it, spray it again, sand it. And so the fiber that raises up from being wet, once you've done that twice and you sand it off, you take off all those fuzzies. So now when you apply this, there's no fuzz left to raise. So you're going to leave yourself with a real clean surface, okay? Now, so that's, you know, that's pretty good black there. Now, there's the maple, not much, and I should have really sanded this surface, you know. I would never use it on maple. But this is the quebracho. I put quebracho on this. All right, that quick. So this is pretty impressive. What this guy says to do is once this is dry, put one more coat of the quebracho on top of this, not the iron acetate. Go ahead and put the quebracho on again as a top coat, and it will make it that much darker. All right, so that's maple. All right, there's not much tannin in that, but it's pretty impressive that you can get a piece of maple to turn that dark that quickly. All right, so I did a piece where I had a big sphere I made of oak, and I did several things to that. I will tell you that this process works much better on ring porous woods, open grain woods. So this next thing I'm going to do, this is a piece of ash, elm, a lot of the oaks, ring porous. Okay, just messing around a little bit here. So just making myself, I wanted to do this so you could get a little bit of what the end grain is like. I didn't do that very well, but okay. So on that big sphere I made, think about this big, I wanted to do something, but I wanted a little bit more of a surface treatment than just making it black. So you don't have to do this with nat gas. You can do it with regular propane. Well, that's toasty. What's that? Yeah. And you can see how the grain really, you can see the annual rings really clearly, okay? And you can burn this so you could leave it like this, all right? And so it's pretty black, all right? But I wanted to get a little bit more on that. And the other thing is I had this big sphere, so just so you know that you can step that up a notch and get a big ass burner for
Flamethrower.
flamethrower for a propane tank, and that works real well because that puts out a fan flame, and then you can really get over a surface pretty quickly by doing it like that. All right.
Is that the black piece you had a strap nailed to this?
Say again?
Around the globe with the strap nailed?
Yeah, that strap was very too though, and so I had to do all that stuff later. So now, one of the things that you can do with rainforest woods, I mean, I can burn cherry and make it black, but what you want to do if you're going to go through the effort to burn it, you can add some on a ring porous wood. You can add something else to it, and that is open up those pores. And you were doing liming, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what was your next step?
The brush. Isn't that the next, yeah.
Yeah.
Whenever you're gonna use the copper, which kind of brush is it?
So I have brass.
Oh, brass. And what is this, what is the torch part called that you buy there, and where do you buy it? For those of us that don't know anything about it.
You can get that at, Home Depot or Lowe's or anything. I like this very much. It's a self-igniting one.
Okay. All right, so.
All right. It's a Burns-O-Matic. And this is MAP gas.
Oh,
You don't need MAP gas. MAP gas burns hotter than propane. I just have it because I've done some metal stuff, and I tend to have it on that.
and that's.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do here, so what I've done here is I have burned in between those rings. So this ash that I'm taking out here right now is the softer part of what's between the rings. And so what you'll end up with, unlike where you're just trying to open up the pores, I'm actually trying to grind away so I have a series of ridges that come out from the ash. Because all I'm trying to do, and you can really feel this, all right, that what you've done is, by doing it this, go ahead and feel it. What does that feel like?
Like all the greens, like corduroy.
Like corduroy. And it does, it really does. So wherever you, okay. So really what I've taken out, Fred, I don't think can you see any corrugation in that?
Yeah.
So you see how rough that's gotten and it's opened up the pores, but where'd my black go? All right. Now I could have left it black, but what I really wanted was this texture. All right. When you do black pieces, what do you have to work with? You only have two things to work with: shape and texture. Those are the only two things you have. So you really want to work on making one of them or both of them unique for each individual piece. Okay? So now I've got the texture that I want, but I want to make it black. Well, how can I make it black? I can use this stuff, all right? And what I did actually was put this into a spray bottle and just sprayed that whole thing, all right?
The tannin or
I didn't, no, it was oak that I was
it's
doing,
oak. Okay,
so I
gotcha.
just used the iron acetate. All right? And that worked great. But there are lots of ways to do it. I could do that, but you see what happens to oak, you know. All right, so let me do another one. This is another classic one. All right, this is leather dye. And I used to have a big bottle of this stuff. But black leather dye, now this is not leather polish, this is dye. And I brought gloves.
Too late now.
But this is another one of those treatments you can do. Let this dry for a minute and I'll pass it around. And you can see how deep that black is, all right? And this really works great on wood. This is easy because it comes with a sponge applicator, okay? But this allows that grain to show through. If I use paint on this, I'm going to hide that texture that I just created, right? And so there are two things that I would use on here. One is leather dye. Another one is this is trans tint black. Okay, this is a very concentrated dye, all right? And it's a powder, and trans tint's water soluble, all right? So this is after the horse is out of the barn. I got a second horse in them.
How does that compare to the iron acetate?
The dye,
Yeah,
the dye's blacker than hell.
okay, so the iron acetate, a little lighter black.
Not with the quebracho. It's pretty black. But the one of the things I like about that is that for things like I'm doing with the finials, I'm just dipping the whole finial in. All right, I don't have to do any brush. I don't have to do any application or any of that. It's also cheaper. you know, I mean, not that this stuff is terrifically expensive, kiwi, shoe dye, but it works pretty well. But what I'm really concerned when I'm dealing with texturized, I want something that I'm going to apply that won't hurt the texture. All right. The other thing is this dye is quite potent. This is the trans tint, and one of the things, if I'm applying dye to something, I like, rather than brushing it on, which you can do, all right, I like applying it with an airbrush because there's no brush marks, all right? It is really a nice coating. You can really control it, how much you want to put on. I can put on a couple of coats if I want to do that, all right? So I tend to use, when I'm applying dye, I generally go ahead and use an airbrush. One of the other things you can use an airbrush for is if I want to apply, when I'm applying dye, I can do it with this. I can do it with the, I make the trans tint. I usually put it in a small squeeze jar like this to fill my airbrush with. But I have another option with an airbrush. And one of the things, now I want to add a little bit of pizzazz with my airbrushing. All right, so I can.
Do you ever use alcohol with the trans tint?
I don't, it doesn't dissolve for me. There's other ones that'll go both ways. But the trans tint for me doesn't work with alcohol. Let me get rid of what's never in here. So this is empty. And another thing you can do, once you step over into the airbrushing, now you have a whole series of things that come with airbrush paints, all right? These are not paints that you're going to apply with a brush. They're only really meant to be applied with an airbrush. And a couple of the things that are unique, you can get black, and it kind of acts like a dye. It kind of looks like the dye. You're just putting a black coating on, but you're putting it on pretty thin because it's an airbrush. But you can get specialized airbrush paints, and this is Auto Pure Colors, and this is a this is a water-based pearlized black. All right, so I wanted to have some black where
You promised.
yeah. Oh. Man, that locked up that quick. Well, that's not going to work so well. But what a pearlized is very, very, very fine mica powder mixed in with the paint. All right. So what you get is a sparkle and shine. So it's not flat black. All right. It's not a flat black that you get. It's a nice. It's a nice sparkly black. And one thing about the sparkle paints or the pearlized paints, they are thicker than regular airbrush paints. And so sometimes you have to thin them out a little bit. The idea is that you can use paints, particularly pearlized paints, that you can't apply any other way, all right? There's also, you can buy things like this. This is Dr. Martin's. This is an iridescent black ink, all right? This will also work. So if I want to, just let's see if I can try what Gene was talking about. Where you can get patterns and stuff. And if you look at one of the recent crazes that's been going around is people getting iridescent paints, all right, and mixing them together, putting some here and pushing it around with an airbrush and another color. Oh, I can't remember.
Yoder. I think it was Yoder.
Yoder did it, but I'm trying to think of the name of the paints. It's a woman's name. Anyway, you start doing this and then you put a little next to it, different contrasting color, and the iridescents really look great. But this is an iridescent ink, and this airbrushes really well too. And so now you're talking about being able to apply an iridescent black, a sparkly black, pearlized black, in addition to any flat black that you may have. Let me put this on a piece of maple, and it'll show a little bit more of the iridescent there.
So Ed, if you use one of those real flat blacks and you want to end up with a kind of glossy finish, like you might have on a piece of real ebony if you sand it up and everything, then what's the next step?
I would, if I had, so say again?
Well, if you wanted a shiny finish like you would have on a piece of real ebony,
Yeah,
once you put this on and you turn the wood black,
right.
then what do you do to make it shiny?
Just top coat it with lacquer. Typically, I can put lacquer on it, but since I'm putting lacquer on, sometimes I just use this. This is black lacquer.
Oh, is that not clear?
This is black gloss lacquer. And so, all right. So when you have a gloss lacquer on top of, you know, the ebonized stuff, you get a nice black surface. And this, I was saying to somebody before, what I'll generally do is take a white pad and buff it off. The white Scotch-Brite pads have no abrasive. All right, it's all a 4/0 steel wool, a little less than 4/0 steel wool. So I take that, and that gets any rust particles. That's why you filter it, otherwise you can end up with little rust spots on it when you ebonize it. But it's much deeper than if I would just apply black lacquer. All right? All right. So now we're going back to texturing. And so one of the things that I like to do, most of you know that I like to add texture to, if I like to add wood burning texture. All right, so this is my wood burner. This is the kind that Graham talks about building. We had sent around here the plans from American Woodworker a couple of years ago. So I make my own tips. That's what I found another use for my Trend air shield for them.
Flip the top air filter on.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop in a second. So, just to show you, you go around and you create a nice surface. Now, if I was doing a stipple, where I'm sitting there and touching every little dot side by side by side, you can get away with that being, it's not black, it's really dark brown. It's a burn. And I have put pieces, you think that they're black, but they're not. They've just been burned with a wood burner, okay? When you do a pattern like this, you've generally got too much space in between, all right? So I could go ahead and dye this with an airbrush. And the reason I would use an airbrush or something to dye this is that to get in and out of all those crevices is easier than a brush. But I'll show you what I typically do. This is more typical.
So you have to coat, you have to put some kind of finish on that.
Yeah, I don't. Especially with stippling, where I've stippled and put it, you know, so close together that that surface looks black, you don't really have to. Sometimes I'll put on, because I don't want to detract, I don't want to make it shiny, all right? Sometimes I could put a light spray of satin lacquer, but really nothing more than that. So I use...
But if you touch it, doesn't it come on char on your finger?
No.
No? Okay.
Not, you know, after I've done this, I mean, yes, there will be some, but not much.
Okay.
And it stays on there. This doesn't come off.
Okay.
But most of the time, I'll go and you have to get some good acrylic for this. So I either use Liquitex heavy body acrylic or golden heavy body acrylic. All right, those are the two artist acrylics. Wait for your 40% coupon. And I'll apply it with a toothbrush. I have done a lot of pieces like this. So you can see that you can really see the texture. There's no of the wood in between. It all goes away, so there's no competition for the pattern. You know, so that works pretty well that way. And, but you need to use a good quality acrylic to do that. If I would use some of these, this kind of stuff, this is Martha Stewart, that's a little better one. This is Folk Art, that's a pretty cheap one. This is another Folk Art one. All of these are a little bit too weak in pigment. But they just don't have enough pigment to do that. And you'll tend to, because they're a lot lower in viscosity, you basically have to print it on. And so what you'll get is some of that texture will fill up with this, paint. I don't like it very much, so I don't use it. Okay, another thing that you have to consider is what kind of surface do you want? What kind of surface do you want to apply some of this stuff to, and what is the end product you want to be delivering? Do I want it smooth? Do I want it to be able to take a real gloss? You're not going to put a gloss finish on an oak piece unless you're really determined to fill up all of those pores. All right? So there are some things you can do. One of the things that I do is I'll use some black gesso. All right? So if I take gesso Now, most of the gesso nowadays, and again, this is a pretty good one, this is Liquitex. It's a pretty good gesso. In the old days, gesso was mainly clay and some kind of suspending agent. Nowadays, it's a version of acrylic.
Base of bucket.
Yeah, so what you would do with this is put this on, let it dry, maybe put on another coat, let it dry, maybe do it one more time, and then sand it fine with some fine sandpaper. And even though this is oak, it'll give you a really smooth surface. So I just did it here where you could see one coat of gesso on oak. This should really take a couple of more.
Does gesso seal that surface?
Yeah,
Does
yeah, because it's an acrylic with a clay pigment in it. All right. And you can see that's not going to be much different. But if I had 3 coats of that on there and sanded in between, it's going to be able to take a smoother surface. This is maple with one coat of gesso on it. If I take that and sand it at 400 grit, you'll have a really smooth surface to be dealing with. All right? And so in that case, if I wanted to do some airbrushing or something and get a really, really shiny finish, that's what I would do. And I did a piece for that where I turned a small sphere, did the gesso, sanded it to about 600. No, that one I did to 1,000, I think. And then I could airbrush that. And when I was done, it just looked like it was made of glass. All right? And so that's what, artists use to prep their canvases and give them a smoother surface to control it. But anyway, that's another thing that you can do, is use gesso to treat the surface of your work. So very common to me, if I want to have if I'm going to apply something to a hollow form, all right, that I want a smooth surface underneath it, what I'll do is, when I do a hollow form, I'll generally get it shaped and hollowed, but leave it on the chuck. All right? I usually leave a space in between. So this is the bottom of the hollow form. I'll do a space like that, and here it'll come out. And here's where I either have my chuck tenon or a faceplate. All right? And that's because I don't want it to crack across here. And usually, because the pith is right here, all right, on an end grain hollow form. And so I usually do this, and I usually don't get that crack. It usually starts out at this edge, migrate up through. So what I'll do is I'll leave that to dry for a few weeks. Then I'll mount it back up, and it'll have warped. But an end grain hollow form doesn't go football shape the way a face grain hollow form does, all right? It may change a little bit, but it's much more relatively round. So I can mount it back up and sand it, all right? I can put it back up on the lathe and sand it. Then when I'm sanding it, I try and get it as smooth as possible. When it's on the lathe, I'll then coat it with a coat of gesso, let it dry, come back, sand it. You got it with gesso. You can sand it with the lathe running, but it'll give you rings. All right, so after you do it this way, by hand, you do it the long way. All right, and then you'll put another coat on. So you put on a couple of coats of gesso, and now you've got a really good surface to deal with. If you've had some defects that you've had a patch and you don't want them to show, all right, it's a good way to deal with that, because you can get a nice clean surface, nice smooth surface that'll take paint. Obviously, gesso is meant to take paint. That's what it's developed for. All right, so that's a really good way to get a nice a nice finish on a piece, particularly like a hollow form. There are a couple more things I want to show. Obviously, you had, it's another one of those. It's amazing how much is out there. This is black green, all right? This one is licorice. This one is sequin black, metallic sequin black, so this is another metallic one. You've got gloss blacks and all that. You've got a lot of options here, but know that if you're applying them with these paints, it's not going to be as high quality surface as if you're doing it with something else. Okay? No, that's another one of the gloss ones. And then, of course, you have milk paint. Now this is, you know, Don was talking about milk paint a couple of weeks ago, and the stuff that he was talking about is the real milk paint. This says milk paint on it, but it's really an acrylic. All right, but it's a tough one. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to talk to you about, something else I use a fair amount, and that is, and this again is particularly useful if I've got a surface that's got some real defects I want to hide. All right, let's say I've got a nice piece, wonderful form, you know, right where you didn't want it, that's where the knot was, you know. And since I'm going to color it anyway, and often I'll put some texture on, sometimes I'll texture it with the battery charger and do all of that, but sometimes I want to get a bigger piece done quicker with a little bit more variety. When it comes to the wood burner, in reality, you've only got a couple of choices. Okay, there's stippling, so that's the dots. You can make a coil out of, pretty easy, you can make a coil pen, and it just goes round and round and round, and you can do lots of different shapes. You can turn it 90 degrees, and you can make a basket shape and all that, or you can do something like this, which is a circle. But if you want something interesting and making peaks and doing all that stuff, you can't do it with this. If you want something that has an interesting surface, one of the ways to do that is to use a gel medium. All right. So this is Liquitex Gloss Heavy Gel. You can go to Walmart and get this, which is acrylic texture paste medium. All right, this is a gel medium. This is a texture paste. They also, Golden and all the Liquitex also make a paste medium. But I'm going to just take some of this out. And now I go back to my acrylics, my heavy body acrylics. And so usually I use a sea sponge for this. And it depends on how much pressure you do, how porous the particular sponges that you're using, but you can develop yourself a really interesting surface on that, and it is black all through that surface, okay, because I've mixed it in with the gel medium, and this will dry to a gloss surface because I use gloss medium. If I use a texture paste, it'll be more matte, all right? So this is a pretty fast way to get yourself a big surface covered, particularly, this is the kind of stuff I use, the wood burning, texturing, this kind of stuff. When I got a old piece of, you know, soft maple or, you know, sweet gum, and I need to get a nice, but the wood is sound, all right, but it's just not pretty. It just doesn't do anything for you. And you've got maybe the brown stain in it, you know, so you don't even have nice spalting. It's just this icky color. And so I'm going to cover it. Well, one of the ways I'm going to cover it is with something like this. And of course, that doesn't have to be black. I can use any color. I did some pieces where I did a series of discs with them that were green on the two ends on both sides with texture. In the center was airbrushed blue, transparent blue to be water. And it was to represent the St. Johns River on this long piece. And so that worked pretty well. And it was easy and fast to do, and I used green and yellow paints with that one. And to be honest, I used some of the I forget who makes it, but they're called Basics at Hobby Lobby or at Michael's, and they're the next level down of acrylic. If I want something good, or if I'm going to make a nice piece, I'm using the heavy bodies. But if I just want something that can add a little color, I'll use the Basics. And doesn't have as much pigment, and it's a lower viscosity, but it works pretty well.
What did you mix the acrylic paint in that you got the gloss rather than the...
This particular medium that I have, this one is gloss heavy gel medium.
Okay, gloss heavy, all right.
Right. There are a million mediums. All right. You can get iridescent mediums, ones with sand, one with perlite in them. They go on and on and on. This is texture paste, and the texture paste isn't much of a gel. It's got more like clay pigment in it, so it dries matte. All right.
And does that stuff chip at all?
I've never had it at all. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, what people use this for mainly, there are two things that I know that artists use this for. One is if you want to add a lot of texture to your paintings, all right? You mix in gel medium with your paints. The other thing is, this is what gourd artists use to put all of their texture on their gourds. All right, there's one more little thing, and then we'll be done. I did a piece called Pods, and I wanted to make it look like a vanilla pod. It was about this big, and I had textured the wood with this, but that wasn't, I wanted it smoother than this, so I didn't put really much of a surface on. When I had a couple of really nice things, like from an air filter once that I had. It was all full of these nylon strings kind of thing that was made up of that. Man, that has a really aggressive texture. The sponge is kind of fine. If I want it finer, I'll use a dish sponge, you know, that doesn't have as much open space as a sea sponge would. So I had a much smoother surface, and the reason I had to do that was because the piece, I recycled it. And it was originally a segmented turning. And I wanted to make it look like a pod. So I returned the top and the bottom, but the whole center part was still all the segments. And I wanted to hide all the segment joints. So I used the acrylic on that. But for the pod, I wanted to add a little bit more to it. And so what I wanted to do was add dots. And if you remember, when Michael Hoslick was here, he put on some of his pieces, he put on pieces that give you a little spike that would come out all over the surface. Well, he has a way of doing that where you go and you mix texture paste with your heavy body acrylics. He adds one more thing to it and then puts it in one of those really fine tipped application jars. And he'll sit there and he'll put dots all over his surface. But I just went and got some puff paint.
What is it called?
Puff paint. Whoa.
Big puff.
Yeah, it's puffed. It's been a while since I opened that one. So can you see that at all, Fred? Can you see this?
Yep.
And there you can see that they've got a real texture to them. So in this case, I did the whole thing with this, with less of a texture than this, okay, smoother than this, and then I went over the whole surface with these. And so it made a really interesting piece that was, people had no idea how that was made. They had no idea it was wood, you know, just didn't know. But that's some of the stuff you can do. Now the challenge for me was to make them black, so I ended up trying to do all these things. Even on the spray can side, there are some things to pay attention to. You got some regular black. This is regular, just cheap Walmart black, not as much pigment. Now they're coming out with this Krylon Dual where it's got primer and pigment in there. It's heavier body. For me, the thing you have to worry about this is light applications, because you're putting on more pigment and more junk on it each time, and you can easily get runs with this stuff. All right. I already talked about the black lacquer. This was another one I used on a piece that I really liked because it looked black, but what it is was brushed oil rubbed bronze. All right, and this gave a really nice metallic color. It was a really warm version of black. So again, you have different varieties of black that you can go out there. You just don't have to be limited with the first one you pick up off the shelf. Go to a couple different stores. And whenever I need a nice quality, just painted black surface, I use this. This is stuff you get at Michael's. Design Master, they have a glossy and a matte. It's about $8 a can, where this is like $2.50 a can. All right, but this one works better. All right, it's got more pigment, and it does a real nice job over the surface. And virtually all of these things come in colors other than black. All right, but I just wanted to show you the variety of things you can do to a finished piece once you've decided to add some color or black to it. You can do a lot of different things to it to give that surface a real quality, and you know, stuff you can just buy local. The only thing I couldn't buy local was the pearlized black airbrush paint, which didn't work tonight.
Shop local.
Shop local. All right, anybody have any questions?
You say that was called touch paint?
Puff,
Puff.
P-U-F-F.
The dragon.
This is Tulip Puffy. Yeah, it's in the fabric aisle.
And what's the shelf life on the iron acetate stuff you made?
I have used stuff that's as old as a year,
Okay.
but you sometimes can see some buildup of iron in there. It's so cheap, you
I
know?
didn't know if you had to make it every time you went to.
No,
or you could
no,
make it
and I
for a
made, I wanted to make sure this was active for here, so I actually started this 2 weeks ago. Friday, I think, and filtered it. But I tested it every once in a while. It could have done earlier.
You have to let it cook for a couple of weeks?
Yes.
At least a week,
Okay.
all right? And for some reason, this guy says, use Heinz. All right, fine. You know, you're talking about it 73 cents more, or not even, I mean, it's $1.90 for a gallon. The other thing is that something that I really feel is pretty important, because this time I used 4-aught. Normally I've used coarser grades. But the guy's talking about the 4-aught dissolves faster, but he was really adamant about washing them. So this time I washed everything, and it seemed to work fine.
And I was just curious about your thought process as to which method you're going to use on each piece. I mean, they're not all just black, I guess.
Yeah, I'll give you some absolute basics for me. I do a fair number of pieces where I'll, in essence, make 2 bowls, all right? To get a piece to make a hollow sphere this big is not so easy, all right? So what I'll do is I'll take a log and I'll cut on each side of the pith, and I'll turn these into 2 identical bowls, and then I'll Gorilla Glue them together, all right? I have to hide that seam, all right? So I'm going to texture it. I'm going to add some kind of texture or burn over it and then paint over it. I'm just doing one now where I'm burning the seam with this particular pen, but I'm going to use milk paint, which has got a thicker body, and so that'll hide that seam. If it's something that I really want the underlying wood character to show through, I'm going to use airbrush or dye. So, and on that sphere, the reason I couldn't burn it and just leave it as was, is obviously this was a solid chunk of wood this big around. I knew where it was going to crack in the beginning, because when I put it up, I could see where the cracks were starting. The cracks went halfway through. I can't get in there with anything. I can't get in there with airbrush paint. I can't get in there with so I used I can't burn it in, I could burn it some, but I couldn't really get in there. So I used the ebonizing solution in a bottle, and then I sprayed, with my airbrush I sprayed dye, and that got it. And so I was black all the way through to the pith. And that was how I did with that particular one.
Does the iron acetate work on wet wood, dry wood, or both?
It should be dry.
Ed, when you're using milk paint, is it all right to use just a regular paint on your base paint when you're going to sand down to it? You don't really want to sand it off?
I haven't used milk paint very much, but my feeling is no. I want to go milk paint to milk paint to milk paint if I'm going to do 3 different colors. I want something that's as tough. Every layer is as tough as it needs to be. So I don't know. I just bought my 3rd color of milk paint to start trying that out. My next piece is going to be.
I bought about 12 the other day.
Holy crap!
I got a real education at the register.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
More questions?
That's why I
There's
put
a
it out
shelf
of
life
town.
on that iron
You
acetate.
got a way to go.
I put some in my cabinet, kind of forgot about it, and when I took it out, it had a huge colony of mold growing
Oh,
inside. I must have been feeding them vinegar or something, but it does have and that had to have been over a year.
yeah. If I'm gonna do something major, like this sphere, where I knew I was gonna be using a lot, I just made it up fresh. All right?